My name's Rick Wise. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly what program Paul has got going on, but the early speaker seemed to have a medical problem, and the guy that was supposed to speak right now had a traffic accident. So watch out for me, make sure nothing happens to me. My name's Rick Wise. I'm the director for South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust. What we do is we preserve and protect battlegrounds here in South Carolina and military sites. We currently have 69 different sites around South Carolina that either we own the property or we have easements on it so we can protect it. And we're also a proponent, along with the American Battlefield Trust, for Liberty Trail. Liberty Trail currently has 30 battlefields from the Revolutionary War that we are interpreting so that folks can go there and visit and learn more about what took place here in South Carolina. Additionally, when we get to full fruition of this thing, the intent is to have about 80 different battlefields in South Carolina that you can do that with. So, is it ambitious? You betcha. Are we going to do it? We're going to do our best. So, the topic today that was supposed to be talked about was Francis Marion and the militia here in South Carolina. Just so happens to not know a little bit about that stuff. So, what we're going to talk about initially is the militia. And then we're going to talk specifically about Francis Marion and what his militia did. Sometimes you will see or read things that say that the militia in South Carolina, you had a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers, and they went and grabbed a musket and they went out and they fought against the British. That is not exactly true, because there was this little thing in the back country of South Carolina particularly that you always had to have a standing militia. Because if you didn't, you had all kinds of brigands that were back here in the back country that would go and try to take advantage of the lack of law enforcement and things that were here in South Carolina. And the other thing is you had Native Americans you had to be concerned about. So these folks had standing militias for their local communities. If you were from 16 to 60 years old, you were a member of the militia. And as a member of the militia, usually after a church service, you would go to the muster ground and you would drill. Now, drilling sometimes was not all that strenuous. The idea is everybody wanted to be like the British Army. You learned how to march in formation. You learned how to deploy into a line to do a battle line and that sort of thing. So you learned the rudimentary aspects of tactics and formations and that sort of thing as a part of being in the militia. Now, it is very true that when you did that, you brought your own weapon. You brought your own ammunition. You brought your own food. That's a very true component of that. And when these folks would come in and go to their drill, it was also an outstanding time to do other things. It was not unknown that somebody would have a drink or two. It was not unknown that people would play cards. And you could find out who amongst the militiamen was a really good cook. And all those things were important. That was a part of socialization at the time. But militias were very much an aspect and component of what people did for their own self-defense. Now let's fast forward. Somewhere around 1760, Francis Marion is 26 years old. And what he does is he joins the militia. And he joins the militia, and he's already been a part of it, but now it's an important part. He is now a lieutenant. And he goes and he is going to train, and he is going to go up against a very formidable enemy, and that's the Cherokee Indians. The Cherokee, through a sequence of events, are now on the warpath in what is now up around the Clemson area of South Carolina and into North Carolina, and Marion joins the militia forces that have been called to gather to go and engage the Cherokee. Marion is under his company commander. A guy just happens to be named Colonel William Moultrie. I take that back, Captain William Moultrie. And when he is going to participate, he is going to be commanding the light infantry. Now, When you looked at militia in the day, everyone learned how to march in that formation and all that stuff. The light infantry were out in front. The light infantry had a specific task that they were supposed to be mobile. You learned how to fight behind cover. You had to learn how to use concealment. And you fought in an expanded formation or an extended formation. It wasn't shoulder to shoulder. You took advantage of the terrain. When they went to do their initial training, they went around the Congarese. The Congarese is the river coming out of Columbia that flows in, and the water in the Congaree becomes the Santee River. So they're training in that area. And it just so happened that as a part of their training, there was a contingent that had come down here, or a detachment, I'll call them that, and they were with Rogers Rangers. You probably have heard of Rogers Rangers before. They wore green uniforms, and they were the folks in the French and Indian War who were out in the woods learning, teaching people how to fight just like the Native Americans did. And so they taught Indian fighting. They taught hit and run, ambush, be able to engage the enemy on his own terms. The idea was, don't give them an advantage. You're fighting from behind cover and concealment. Rogers had 32 different rules. There were like 18 standing Rogers rules of warfare. Okay, and Rogers rules, rule number 1, and I tell you, I'm a retired Army officer. We use the Ranger Handbook. It talks to you about patrolling and all that kind of stuff. Those rules, if you pick up a modern Ranger Handbook, are in the front of it. Rule number 1, don't forget nothing. And it would tell you things. When you leave your camp, whatever route you go out on, you come back a different way so you don't get ambushed. Always keep your firelock ready for action. Always make sure your tomahawk is sharpened. All the things, little rules of warfare, but there are also things about patrolling and all that sort of stuff that led them to be what they were supposed to be, able to engage the Indians on their own terms. And Marion was very good at it. But Marion also learned some other things. When you're talking about dealing with militia, they were being trained by regular Army officers. And those regular Army officers could be haughty. They looked down on these other folks. You had ultimate discipline over those soldiers who wore those red uniforms of the British Army. They were more afraid of their officers and NCOs than they were of the enemy because of the discipline imposed on them. If you tried to do the same thing to the militia, they would vote on it. They would vote on it with their feet and they would leave. They did not follow the same rules and regulations in their minds that those regular soldiers did. They were not being paid. They were not being armed. They were not being done anything except maybe given some food and ammunition. So therefore, they were not going to play that game. Francis Marion learned in his experience in the Cherokee War that you had to treat militia differently. You couldn't keep them under the same, let's say, policy that you would regular soldiers that are being paid and are basically under your command in that regard. So it made a big difference. Marion also learned something, and it was about reprisals. If the Cherokee came in and they scalped people and did that sort of thing, and when you went into their camp and did the same thing, it just generated a whole series of reprisals, and it's never ending. He learned from that experience too. After the Cherokee War, Marion went back to his plantation and became a farmer. Now, I believe it was Hugh Rankin, Dr. Hugh Rankin wrote a great biography on Marion, and in it, he said that Marion's life was like a really spicy piece of meat in between two slices of stale bread. Because before his combat experience, not so much, a lot in the combat experience and not so much afterwards. So, as you look at Francis Marion, he was about to go into that spicy meat section that I'm telling you about. 1775. Marion is a representative. He's been elected as a representative by the folks in his community. He goes in, and the first provincial Congress, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to form regiments. Now, these are not going to be militia regiments. They're going to be state regiments. They're going to be paid by the state, armed by the state, uniformed by the state, given ammunition, just like regular soldiers. That was the whole intent. And when Marion gets in there and he starts to do that, one of the things he discovers is that he's got leadership capability. And there are a number of captains that are named by the Continental Congress, and when they voted for these, Marion is tied for third with another guy. So you can tell that he's got high acclaim because the provincial Congress has now named him a captain. And he goes out and he raises men, and he is in the regiment commanded by Colonel William Moultrie. Things are going well for him too. So they are the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. The 2nd South Carolina Regiment has these little leather helmets, and there's a crescent on it with liberty on the thing. You might notice something on my hat that looks sort of like that. And they are now going to go and be engaged in a number of actions. Marion has got a claim. They send him over to Fort Dorchester. At Fort Dorchester, he is going to be guarding the fort that is there and the ammunition magazine. They're concerned that the British might try to come into Charleston and take their gunpowder and stuff, so they have moved it to Fort Dorchester, a very important post. Marion commands these guys, and then he is recalled back to Charleston. One of the neat things there is that I think the guy's name was Lieutenant Dickens. I may be wrong on that, but anyways, when Marion leaves, in his orderly book, he writes, "I want to commend all the officers and soldiers of the regiment for the outstanding duty they have done here at Fort Dorchester, with the exception of Lieutenant Dickens." Oddly enough, Lieutenant Dickens later becomes a loyalist, and Marion is wanting to go after him, but he can't quite get there because of the men. But that's another story for another day. Anyway, so Marion is called back into Charleston. Now I'm giving you, we're going to talk about militia, but we got to figure out their commander, what he's done. Marion goes, and he is one of the guys that is helping supervise the building of that palmetto log fort at Fort Sullivan in Charleston. 2nd South Carolina is there. They have a contingent of artillerymen from the 4th Regiment. That's the artillery regiment for the South Carolina troops. And they are training these men how to operate the cannon. One of the orders of the day for the 2nd South Carolina talks about that the officers are to report to this location where men from the 4th Regiment are going to teach them how to operate the cannon and how to be artillerymen. Is that going to be important? Absolutely, because that palmetto log fort on the 28th of June 1776 is going to see the British trying to come in into Charleston, and the first way to get into Charleston is they got to take that fort. Those palmetto logs are absolutely fantastic. They're spongy, they absorb those cannonballs, and it is not torn apart like most people thought it would be. If it had been any other type of a hardwood, it would have been a bad day for the Patriots. But as it was, they maintained that fort, and later, after the battle, actually recovered 7,000 British cannonballs that had been fired at them. Marion commanded the left side of the fort. The left side of the fort was the ones that were engaging the HMS Bristol and the Experiment. The Bristol was Commodore Sir Peter Parker's flagship. Now, Peter Parker is not related to Spider-Man that we know of. Okay, that's because his name was Peter Parker. But anyways, so as you take a look at this, one of the last shots that was fired actually took the seat of Commodore Parker's pants off. And there's even a poem written about it in British newspapers, basically about him losing half his butt. Anyways, so Marion has been a very successful leader to this point, commanding regular troops. A lot of people after Palmetto Log Fort, Fort Sullivan, a lot of people get promoted. To include Colonel Moultrie is now General Moultrie. Because of the sequence of promotions, Marion, who was a major at the Palmetto Log Fort, is now Lieutenant Colonel Commandant of the 2nd South Carolina. He is the commander. He's not a full colonel. The reason he's not a full colonel is they created this post, Lieutenant Commander Commandant, because British regiments were led by lieutenant colonels, not colonels. And so if you were exchanging prisoners, you could exchange a lieutenant colonel for a lieutenant colonel, but not the other way around. So that's why they changed it. Technically, Marion's next promotion was supposed to be to brigadier general, but at the end of the war, they forgot about all that, and he did not get that promotion that he sorely deserved. Marion now commands these folks from 1776 until 1779, when they go in October to Savannah. They're trying to kick the British out of Savannah. Marion commands his troops at Spring Hill Redoubt. A deserter went and told the British where they were going to attack. It was a bad day for the 2nd South Carolina. There were 2 flags that were given to them after their action at Fort Sullivan. One of them was captured there, and it wasn't captured like you would think. It was underneath the body of the dead officer who was carrying it. The other, Sergeant Jasper, who had gone and replaced the colors at Fort Sullivan, Sergeant Jasper grabbed the colors that were going down the second set of them, and he advanced up and planted them on the rampart when he was mortally wounded. But they took the flag and put it inside the uniform and were able to get it out of there. So one of those flags survived, but was later captured at Charleston. Marion goes back to Charleston, and actually he is commanding the intermediate post between Savannah and Charleston when he grows a mustache. Believe it or not, that's one of those little human interest stories. Francis Marion with a mustache, and he writes to one of his friends that I have a magnificent set of mustachios, and that we have all grown mustaches while we were here at Sheldon Church. So he was definitely put in a position of responsibility. And he gets back to Charleston, and of course at the siege of Charleston, the entire Southern Army is lost. 5,400 men or so are captured, but Francis Marion is not. Francis Marion supposedly went to a party, and when he went to the party, it was a shut-in party. And what they would do is they would bring everybody in, lock the door, and then there was wine, women, and merriment. It was what in the Army we called, mandatory fun. Okay, well, Marion did not believe in mandatory fun, and so he decided that what he would do is he would leave the party. You couldn't go out the door, so he went to the second floor, and either he jumped from the balcony or he jumped from a window. Folks, I believe it's 106 or 108 Trad Street over in Charleston. That house is still there. You look at that second floor balcony. I have been a paratrooper. I would not want to jump from that balcony. But Marion jumped and hurt his ankle. So much so that he was now not able to command his regiment. And as a result, he was what was called a supernumerary officer. And that supernumerary officer went back, or was ordered to leave the city along with other folks. He went back to his plantation or in the general area. He hung out in the swamps. And what he then did, he finally made his way. Remember, they're looking for former Continental soldiers. Marion is the second highest ranking Continental officer that got out of Charleston. The other would be an Isaac Hugie. So word had come that they wanted anybody that was able to get away to go up into North Carolina and join up with the Continental Army. Marion did. He links up just south of Hillsboro, and Baron Johann de Kalb is there. He's got the Maryland Division, He's got the Delaware Division, or the Delaware Regiment, and he has come into North Carolina, was going to the relief of Charleston. He got as far as Hillsborough when he found out that they had been captured. Okay, so he is now going to rebuild the army. But what Congress has done is they've sent General Horatio Gates to take command, the hero of Saratoga. Okay, several heroes at Saratoga, probably none of them being Gates. Okay, but he is coming to take command. When Marion shows up, there's a guy, he's the deputy adjutant. He is Colonel Otho Holland Williams of the Maryland Division. And he writes of Marion and his men, a Colonel Marion of South Carolina arrived with about 20 men. They were young, they were old. They were black, they were white. Their weapons were atrocious. Their dress was burlesque. The only good thing about them is they were all mounted. Marion and his men drew the laughter of the regular soldiery, and it was all their commanders could do to keep them from openly laughing at them in public. It was such so that the general sent Marion away of his own volition to get him out of camp. For years, people have thought that they were talking about General Gates didn't like Marion and sent him away. It was Baron DeKalb who sent him away. Okay, so I need to let you know something here. I've been the guy that has been the managing editor of the Francis Marion papers. And a little announcement here, the 27th of this month, the first volume of the Francis Marion papers is coming out. It'll be available online. You can get it free of charge. Huzzah! And then the other two volumes are coming out. It's going to be over 900 pages. Okay, so a lot of this is just coming out. The Marion papers have never been published. People haven't had all the truth about Marion. And one of the things is, as you look at this, is that Marion did get sent away from camp. He talked to Baron DeKalb. DeKalb took a liking to Marion, particularly the fact that they were mounted, and talked to Marion about the fact that he had worked with partisans in Europe. And DeKalb, working with partisans, talked to Marion and Peter Horry about the importance of a partisan group and the effectiveness they had operating in the enemy's rear area, where they could engage supply columns, installations, and keep the enemy off balance, where they could gather intelligence, whether they could keep the enemy always looking for them, and it would take away resources from the enemy because of their actions. And it was absolutely true. Marion did get sent away from camp, and there's a letter from Baron DeKalb to General Richard Caswell, former governor of North Carolina, telling him, you would be well to become acquainted with Colonel Marion of South Carolina, whom I have sent to gather intelligence and forage at Coles Bridge. So he sent Marion out on a mission. He didn't send him away so that people wouldn't laugh at him. He gave him a mission. Marion made his way with Gates' army. Gates actually had him ride in his vanguard and came into South Carolina. And then there was the Battle of Camden. Worst defeat, tactical defeat of a Continental Army in the American Revolution. And Francis Marion, again, God shining down on him, he was not there. A letter had come in from Major John James of the Williamsburg Militia, from over near King Street, right up the road here a little way, and they were looking for an experienced commander. And Gates looks around, and there's Francis Marion right there. The 15th of August, the day before the Battle of Camden, Marion receives the orders to go to the Santee River, burn all the boats, so that way Cornwallis wouldn't be able to get back to Charleston. And when he's doing that, also take command of the Williamsburg Militia. Marion had no authority to take command of them because he had a Continental Commission. He did not have a militia commission. So Marion says, Roger out, and they mount up and they move. They actually heard the gunfire from the battle the next morning and continued to march. About the 17th of August, Marion is over here at Johnsonville, South Carolina. Just a short way up here. You'll see the statue of Marion there at Venture's Landing now, which was Witherspoon's Ferry back then. And Marion steps up in front of these folks, and William Dobin James, who was 15 years old, he was John James' son. He was one of the guys who served under Marion as a 15-year-old and 16-year-old, and he wrote about Marion's arrival. He said that Marion came in and he had a red round coat on him. I guess a very short, tight-fitting coat. That he limped. Yep, he still had a problem with that ankle from Charleston. That he had a dark complexion, black eyes, high forehead, jutting chin, hooked nose. He was below medium height. We think he was about 5'2" or 3. He weighed about 130 pounds. And this guy's going to step in front of you and become your leader. He's wearing that helmet with the crescent on it of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. And he has absolutely no authority to command you other than the leadership that he exudes to you that day. And I like to think that Marion, don't know if he stayed on his horse or not, but he addressed the men who were gathered there that day. And I think it went something like this. I come before you here today and I can give you nothing. I can give you no ammunition, I can give you no food, I can give you no weapons, I can give you no horses, I can't clothe you. But what I can do is I can lead you against your enemies, and I can help deliver you and your homes from the clasp of an enemy who will do you harm. When we do this, I know that you are militia. I know that when you are here, there is no one there to protect your families. I have a standing policy. Come when you can, go home when you need to. But by God, when you are here, you will follow my commands and the commands of the officer who are over you. You will have discipline, and we will fight together, and together we will deliver us from the oppression of the enemy. We are not sitting back and waiting on things to happen. We have a mission. We're going to burn the boats on the Santee River to keep the British from being able to cross, and you are the ones who are going to do it with me. We will be successful. Officers to me, men, you're dismissed. I don't know if that's how his speech went or not, but they followed him. And when they followed him, they burned the boats on the Santee. And then he went to Great Savannah and he freed 150 prisoners that were being marched to Charleston. And then he went and he was at Port's Ferry over near Johnsonville, over near Snow's Island. And at Port's Ferry, two brothers came in and said that their father had been taken prisoner. And when their father being taken prisoner, they were concerned that not only had he been robbed, but what would happen next. Marion was not moved by what they said too much, because he said, I have 53 men, and you just come in and told me they have 250. And then he thought about it. Those men are going to come here and are going to attack us here. So what are you going to do? Francis Marion told his men to get rest. And as in the Army we call O-Dark 30, he woke those 53 men up and they marched. And they attacked the first element of Major Micajah Gainey's loyalists and drove them away. And then he went after the rest of them, and as he said, he caught 200 of them on the march. Now Marion's letter to General Gates said that he attacked them directly and drove them to a swamp fit only for Tories. William Dobin James says that in a classic Marion account that Marion struck them and drew them into an ambush. The same type ambush he learned to do from Rogers Rangers in the Cherokee War, and drove them into the swamp. And if you haven't been there, it's the Little PD Swamp. I have been there doing a staff ride for Special Forces guys, and you can go in and see where the swamp drops off 16 feet into the area that goes down to the river. And that's where he drove them in. That, ladies and gentlemen, another guy named Napoleon called audacity. When Marion got back to his camp, he no longer had 53 men. He had 100 men. Success brings people in. Now, the militia that Marion commanded, how many folks have seen The Patriot? Okay, if you've seen The Patriot, you remember the scene where they see smoke in the distance and they get there and the man has found that his wife and son have been killed? Happened every day in the backcountry. General Greene wrote to General Washington that butchery takes place in the backcountry of South Carolina on a daily basis. You have to remember that the men that came to Marion, and one of the complaints against Marion, at least by General Sumter and other folks, was that he could not get enough men to do anything. He only had 50 men on this day, or maybe 100 men on that day, but never consistent. Marion was worried about that too, because he never had enough men consistently that you could plan an operation. Because when you pulled out, you didn't know how many men were going to be there. It wasn't like a regular Army unit. So with Marion trying to pull folks together, the problem that he had is that every time those men left their homes, they didn't know what they would find when they got back. They didn't know if their wives and kids would be okay. They didn't know if they would have a home left. They didn't know if they would have their smokehouse had been pillaged. And it was not just soldiers, but it was the loyalists living in the area. Ladies and gentlemen, South Carolina was a site of civil war during the American Revolution. And if you go to 1861 to 65, the closest enemy from somebody here in Lake City, South Carolina, may have been in Virginia or Tennessee or Mississippi or Georgia maybe. But if you were here in South Carolina during the American Revolution, it's your next door neighbor. It's your brother. It's your father. Edward Lacey had to put his father under guard because his father was going to tell them that his unit was going to attack the next day. As a matter of fact, his father, who was old and doddering, apparently they said, somehow escaped. And they had to go and catch up with him and tie him up. So when you look at that, you know, the fact that Marion is bringing militia in to fight these folks and that they can keep showing up, success is a part of that. Without a doubt, success is a part of that. And so, if you look at what is going to happen here, Marion has to be successful because that's the biggest draw he's got for these folks. Can you imagine this? They would ride 60 miles in a night and conduct an ambush and come back. But you would send several patrols out to different sites. He had a great intelligence network. And all this is guerrilla warfare, partisan warfare, intelligence, support by the local community, being able to bring people in, and when folks got in, you would fight, but it was not decisive combat. Hit and run, come back, and you're like smoke. You dissipate. As a matter of fact, there was a guy you may have heard of, Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong in 1937 is writing about fighting the Japanese in China. He's talking about guerrilla warfare, and he has 18 rules of guerrilla warfare. Francis Marion did every one of those 18 intuitively. As a matter of fact, one historian said that Mao Zedong must have been on the back of Marion's horse, because all the things that he did intuitively. And one of the things you can't do, you cannot get involved in decisive warfare. You know, a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, these battles were lost by the Patriots because they left the battlefield and they left the enemy there on the battlefield. But whoever stays on the battlefield won. Well, not if your mission is to disrupt. You're not trying to take ground. You're not trying to take a bridge and hold it. You're not trying to take a hill and hold it. What you're trying to do is disrupt the enemy. And they were extremely effective like that. There was one word that would bring terror into the hearts of the Tories and the British. And if you send all these tentacles out like that, and they'd have ambushes here, 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 you're hitting the middle of the night, you're hitting early morning, not too much in daytime. These guys are sitting around the campfire looking over their shoulder. It's very difficult to see from the light to the dark and wondering who is there. And many times the woods would sparkle with musket and rifle fire as what they feared came to fruition. And that one word that terrorized them was Marion. Because every one of these tentacles that went out, Marion might be sitting at Snow's Island or Port's Ferry or Indiantown or any of the other places, but every one of those actions that took place had one name, Marion. So he became the terror. But it was the terror to the Tories. But here's another thing. Marion had a command for his men. You will not pillage and plunder. At the end of this, these people who are our enemies are going to be our neighbors again. And the whole thing about reprisals came back around full circle, where he said, we will not do that to them so that we can mend our wounds at the end of the war. And later on as a legislator, he did that. He would not support retaliation. The militia came and fought and went home when they needed to. And the sad thing is, at the end of the war, when the British pulled out of Charleston on December 14th, 1782, and Charleston was captured, you had Continental troops under Mad Anthony Wayne from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and other folks that were there. But you know who was not there? The militia. The militia were not allowed to go into Charleston. The same folks who on several occasions, Marion's militia were the only ones in opposition to the British. And yet, at the end of it, they were pushed away. So when we look at this, what Francis Marion and his men accomplished, what Thomas Sumter and his men accomplished, Marion sat right here in the cauldron. You had Georgetown, you had Camden, you had the area around Horry County was a hotbed for Loyalist support, and Marion sat in the middle. He could not draw too many people because of the fear at home. Sumter could draw 1,000 men. The British thought that that was their biggest threat. Sumter was though he commanded militia, he was a big arrows on maps kind of guy. Okay, Marion was a focus on the tactical situation. He was very concerned about his troops. He was very concerned about not wasting his men's lives. There were only 2 actions in which Marion's men came out on the bad side of things. One of them he wasn't there, and the other one he commanded the cavalry to charge, and they were actually SCH59M's cavalry, and instead of charging, they went off to the right, and it caused everything to fall apart. But if you're 68-2, that's not a bad thing. The militia played a critical role here, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, the American Revolution was won here in South Carolina from 1780 to 1782. It was a stalemate in the North, and the actions here are why Cornwallis went to Virginia after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. He went up there and got captured. Yorktown did not end the American Revolution. It continued on from October 1781 to December 1782 here in South Carolina. And the militia played a major role in the victory that was acquired for our nation right here. Thank you all very much.
Good job. Good job. Good job.
Okay, any questions?
I read that Francis Marion was on this property. Is that true? Possibly.
Paul Graham, who owns he has inherited the farm here, actually has receipts where Francis Marion signed for receiving supplies from here. And so, you know, Marion's men came all through here. Supposedly, some of the prisoners that were captured at Great Savannah, when some of the other Continental prisoners were released, were brought through here on the way to North Carolina.
So,
Yes, ma'am.
could you rename what you said the book's name was that you're going to have published? Or is
It's going to be the Francis Marion Papers. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to make the official announcement on the 27th of February. That's the anniversary of Francis Marion's death, and we have a commemoration ceremony each year at his tomb, which is over at Belle Isle Plantation over near Pineville. And at that event, we're going to announce the release of the first volume of the Marion Papers.
And so where does one find that, or how does one?
We're going to try to get it out there. You can go either to South Carolina 250th website, or you can go to the South Carolina Battleground Trust website and be able to get that information. And there'll be press releases that should get out and about, and we'll get the link out so that people can access it. Charles, my good friend, late Charles Baxley. Charles was the commissioner for the 250th Commission, and the discussion we had, he had asked me to be one of the editors of this, and it was a lot of work. I'll put it that way. Dave Nealon is the guy who put all this together. It was his manuscript, and so he's the chief guy in this thing, and all we were was putting it. I'm a military historian, so I was trying to put context for the letters and stuff as far as the military aspects of it. And but this will be just a plethora of information, and I will tell you that we found that the previous biographers and historians that wrote about Marion, that they did not have access to this information, obviously, and there are several aspects of Francis Marion that they got wrong. They said that Marion didn't want to serve under Sumter, and that Marion drug his feet and he dispersed his troops so he wouldn't have to serve under Sumter and all that stuff, and that he did not communicate with Sumter when Sumter came doing what was called the Rounds Campaign. None of that's true. Sumter's first letter that he wrote to Marion, which he wrote it the day he started a siege at a place called Fort Granby over near Columbia, over in Columbia, and it took 6 days for that letter to get to him. When Marion got it, he responded to him immediately. okay, and said, I will be here at this time. And he was. Sumter wrote him again and said, you need to come to me. Marion said, Roger out. And he started marching south. Sumter felt threatened, marched north. They literally passed each other. Okay, and then when Marion got another letter, said, hey, we really need to get together. So Marion was leaving, I believe it was Cord's Plantation, crossed, if you take Highway 52 and cross the Santee River, that was Murray's Ferry. He crossed Murray's Ferry, and Captain Zachary Candy from Camden met Marion and said, Watson is marching, he's got about 400 men, we think he's going that way. Marion went and ambushed him at Waibu Swamp and started the 4 engagements that were Waibu Swamp, Mount Hope Swamp, Lower Bridge, and Sandpit River Bridge that were part of the Bridges campaign. And at that point, when he got into intelligence where the enemy was, and Marion at that time had about 400 men himself, and he changed tactics. Instead of hit and run tactics and all that, he started doing more conventional tactics. He trained his men, and when he trained his men, they were able to engage the enemy on almost equal terms. They did a delay, ambush and a delay at Waibu, an ambush and a delay at Mount Hope Swamp. They defeated them by getting to the bridge first at Lower Bridge, and then they drove them across the river at Sandpit River Bridge with an attack. Okay, his men learned, because Marion, being the guy he was, as a good conventional guy, trained his men. And by training them, they were able to be effective. Probably one of the key points of that is the Battle of Eutaw Springs. Greene started using pretty well the tactics that Morgan did. He had a militia line and he had his regular line behind it coming up. Francis Marion commanded the first line at Eutaw Springs, all of them being his militia. Malmedy out of North Carolina, Andrew Pickens, it was like the all-star team was there. Henderson, who was actually commanding Sumter's guys, and they're in the attack. Remember, at Morgan at Cowpen said, give me 2 shots. At Eutaw Springs, in the attack against regular British units, the 63rd and 64th Regiment of Foot, Marion's men averaged 17 shots apiece. And the only reason they were driven back is that they were out of ammunition. And speaking of that, all those little tentacles I talked about, these guys would on occasion be riding 60 miles to attack an enemy with only 2 rounds apiece. And some of them were told only fire 1, so we have ammunition in case we get in trouble on the way home. Any other questions? Sir?
Yeah. You know, he seemed to have this better morals, I guess. Was that part of his background or whatever originally, or where does that come from? Because it seems unusual kind of a thing. Was that from the Huguenot background, or we don't know much about any of that stuff?
I think part of it could have been his upbringing, but also, you know, as a soldier you learn and experience. I think Marion witnessed things in the Cherokee War that bothered him, and that he did not want to see that type of war be brought into his home area. Because if you do that, you are really going to have a problem. Because after the war, it won't heal.
Yeah.
Do you know if any of the loyalists in the Carolinas deserted the British side and joined the American Army?
Oh yeah, people went back and forth all the time. Hey, there's a story of a guy that was captured, a British guy was captured at Saratoga. He joined the American Army and was captured by the British at Camden, okay? And then later on, that same guy was captured by the Americans again, I believe at Guilford Courthouse, and then he fought all the way up through Eutaw Springs, I believe. So yeah, you know, it's sort of like we were talking in the earlier talk today about who did, you know, who was a loyalist and who was a patriot. Well, a lot of times it depended on who was sitting in your yard with a musket across their saddle. You know, because hey, it was a difficult time. Most people just wanted to be neutral.
I have one more question. Did any of the black loyalists fight in any of the major battles in the Carolinas, like Kings Mountain, Cowpens, or Camden?
Yeah, there were blacks that fought in every battle. You know, some of them were free. There's Jim Capers. Jim Capers was a drum major. He was a drum major at the Battle of Camden, and of course, drum majors back then, that was important because the drums were, you gave commands with your drums. Okay, so he's like your commo officer. Okay, Jim Capers was at Camden. He joined up with Francis Marion. He fought with Francis Marion, and he was wounded at Camden, and he was wounded again at Utah Springs. He had a wound in his head, I believe, from a saber. Had another like bayonet wound, I believe, and then he was shot through the side and killed the drummer behind him. And then his pension statement says that this guy, African American, was at the surrender at Yorktown. I mean, you know, there used to be a radio thing when I was a lieutenant at Fort Sill, and it was called Chicken Man. And Chicken Man was everywhere. Well, that was Jim Capers. He was everywhere. Okay, and after the war, he was applying for a pension, and he had moved out to Mississippi, and apparently he lived to be 110 years old. You know, so pretty good for a guy that got shot up and such. Okay, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.